Hey, welcome back. It's time to look at Cantos 13 through 18 of Purgatorio, and I may have to divide this into two parts like last week, so let's let the first part be the prideful. Bum 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 bum, Purgatorio, ba bum 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 bum. So let's let the first part be the envious with Cornice 2. And before we begin, as I've done the last couple of weeks, I want to talk about another great resource. Now, this is Purgatorio by Sando Burke and Marcus Sanders, and Sando Burke has done the illustrations for it. They have an Inferno, a Purgatorio, and a Paradiso. It's not a translation, but it's kind of a paraphrase, and they take a lot of liberties with it. It's an extremely cool book, and the art that they do along with it, they sort of imitate the Gustave Doré prints, which are so famous, but instead of putting them in the sort of traditional underworld or afterlife, they are placed in very urban settings. And so it's got a feel of modernizing the text. They also take those long extended metaphors that Dante uses and they modernize them, they give them new twists, and they simplify a lot of things. I will say that it's not great to read until you've read several different translations and feel very comfortable with the text yourself, because it makes a lot of errors and it glosses over lots of sections. Like when Dante feels like the whole Francesca and Paolo thing is really unfair. Hey, after all, why is it they were just in love? What's wrong with that? When obviously that's not the point of that section. Still, it's a really cool and unique way of looking at these stories, and the art is really cool, so I highly recommend you check it out after you feel really good about the text. So before I get into the notes for this week's section, I'd like to make a couple comments on your notes, Harrison, from last week, which were really fantastic. So one of the things that you mentioned was the fact that Dante and Sordello and Virgil go stand above the negligent rulers. They actually stand up on the cliff face and look down at them for a little while before the night falls at the beginning of our last reading. And you commented on how that has to do perhaps with Dante sort of looking down on these rulers and placing himself up above them, which is, I think, a really great point, and I wish I had thought of that. Dante definitely has issues with pride and has issues with thinking himself better than others and thinking that he can do a better job than others very frequently. And so we have to watch out for that, especially when Dante gets into politics. Dante really thought that he could, help to fix Florence, and that went really badly. So perhaps that sort of reflects his desire to get mixed up in politics and to try to exert himself perhaps, over the clumsy rulers of his day. But we see that even Dante really fails there, and Dante knows by the time he's writing this that he fails, and so maybe he sort of needs to remind himself and correct himself, as we're going to see with pride. He definitely admits pride is a problem all throughout. You also posed the question of whether the souls here can really be tempted. What is their fate if they succumb to the serpent that they see, but that's chased off by the angels? The point is moot because the angels do chase off the serpent, but the fact that the serpent exists indicates that there is some sort of threat there. I don't know the answer to it, and I think that it's purposefully undermined. I think that perhaps the serpent is never really allowed through because the people will always have that kind of faith because of where they are now. The souls here in Purgatory are upward looking and they are upward seeking. There's that chance to slide back, but they still are going forward. And these souls also are not inside of Purgatory yet, so maybe the problem would be that they would slide backwards and that they would take longer to get into Purgatory. But I'm pretty sure they're already set for Purgatory and so ultimately set for heaven. There's not really going back to hell at this point. And you referenced the idea that the eagle could represent something about the Roman Empire and the significance of the Roman Empire, and I think that's important too. Dante talks a lot about empire and about also the Roman Church, and those two structures and their sort of tension and the way that they have worked in the past and also failed in the past, and there's something about that in our reading from this week, isn't there? You also pointed out how Dante is very eloquent about the sculptures and then kind of speechless and unable to even describe the people who with the boulders on their heads. The distinction between those two, this great eloquence and smoothness of his poetry versus the I don't know what I'm seeing or looking at. And that has to do with the idea of pride and correction. I think that's a great point and very well made. You point out that the guardians in hell are threatening and also don't really seem to understand why Dante is there, whereas the angels seem to accept it much more readily and speed him along. I think that's a great point. There's so much contrast between the two. So Canto 13 starts with the whip of envy. They arrive on the second cornice after passing through the first cornice, which was the prideful. And in this cornice, we are observing the sin of envy, one of the 7 deadly sins, one of the 7 P's that are etched into Dante's forehead that is going to be removed at the end of the cornice. And there's a huge contrast between this cornice and the previous cornice. In the previous cornice, everything was very visual. The first thing that happened when we stepped into the prideful cornice were these huge, ornate sculptures that Dante looks at and examines in great detail. And then there's a whole lot of discussion of seeing and sight and perception. And it ends with the reign of pride, which had the art on the ground that Dante looked at. Well, now that we get up to envy, everything is bare, everything is plain and dark in color, like a bruise. And we have that huge shift from the very visual experience of the prideful to the envious, because in the envious section, nothing is about sight. Sight is actually withheld from all of these people. So the first thing that happens as they step onto this cornice is they don't really see the way to go, and as usual, Virgil doesn't know the way, but there's no one to ask at the moment, so Virgil turns to the sun and seeks the sun as a source of guidance. And they continue to spiral around the mountain, and as we saw in the Inferno, everything was spiraling down, down, down to the left constantly. Now that we're on Purgatory, we're constantly spiraling right. And if you remember from my Inferno notes, the spiral is a really significant shape or symbol. A circle is the journey of the soul, a line is the quest, so the spiral, which is moving on, is a sort of a spiritual journey, a spiritual quest. And so Dante is again spiraling, this time right instead of left, as he was in the Inferno, because he's heading towards heaven now. And everything is inverted from the Inferno. And he hears these voices, these spirit voices that seem to call out to him, 3 of them. Just like before, we had 3 images that reminded him of the virtue that overcomes pride. Now we have 3 voices that remind us of stories in which virtue overcomes envy. And what virtue overcomes envy? Well, envy is really looking at others and, oh, I want that. I want what you have, and I wish your downfall so that I could take from you. And so instead of that, charity and love, looking at someone else and saying, I love you, and so I'm putting you before myself. I'm not looking at your stuff as if I want it. I'm looking at your needs and putting your needs before mine. As you noticed last time, the first whip of pride was the story of Mary. And this time, the first whip of envy is also of Mary. In fact, every single time, the first whip is always going to be about the life of Mary, and there are always going to be 3 of them. And so we can really begin to follow the pattern there. The first one is in Latin, actually, and it is Mary telling Jesus they have no wine. It's from the miracle of the wine, the water to wine, at the Feast of Cana in the Bible, in which Mary noticed a need that these people, her host, had, and so she asked her son to help them. So she thought of others, and she gave out for others instead of envying them and wanting to take from them. The next one is the phrase, I am Orestes. And Orestes is a story about a man who was condemned to death, but his best friend took his place and said, oh, I'm Orestes. But at the moment, Orestes realized what his friend was doing, and so he tried to stand up and claim that he was Orestes, and back and forth they were shouting, I am Orestes, I am Orestes, in order that the other would not have to suffer and die. So thinking of others, sacrificing the self for others. And the third phrase that's spoken is, love thy enemies, or love your enemies. And it is very much that, hey, instead of being angry at enemies and wanting what they have, I love them and express love to them. So Dante is confused by these, and as I already mentioned, Virgil goes ahead and explains the whole function of each of the cornices and the pattern that we're going to see. The 3 whips, the actual sin, and then the rain. When we arrive and we see the envious, they're all praying. Notice how we see a lot of singing and praying with all of the spirits that we run into. Each one is praying a prayer that is adapted a bit to their sin. And this time, the envious souls are not praying individually for themselves, but they're praying for themselves all as a collective. And so instead of saying, please help me, please pity me, they're saying, please help us. The envious have had their eyes stitched shut with metal bands. Ouch! And they are sitting there leaning against each other and leaning against the wall because they are blind. And there's so much great, really detailed imagery here, where Dante really captures what it's like to be around someone who's blind. They're constantly trying to lean towards the sound, but not looking directly at Dante. They're sort of searching for it. And even Dante spends a lot of time sort of searching almost blindly through this section. There's a moment when someone speaks, and Dante kind of has to look around for a moment before he finds him. And so we have a lot of that sort of same blind imagery. Their blindness, of course, is their sight being shut off, and the way that they're always looking at others' things and desiring what they saw. Now they can no longer see. That's being withheld from them. And also they're leaning on each other because they are finally relying upon each other instead of desiring to take from each other. They're supporting each other as they never did in life. And they're being supported by the mountain itself, which is helping to purge them. This is God's punishment on them, but they're being supported by that purification process and ultimately leading them to heaven. Also, John Chardy comments on the bruise color of the cornice, the livid color, and it is dark because of the way they looked at others and desired things from others, and it sort of seemed to bruise them in their envy. It's an interesting idea. They're also wearing haircloth, so instead of the fineries, perhaps, that they envied of their neighbors, they're wearing the most miserable fabric of all time. And it's a kind of cloth that you would wear in penitence. It rubs your skin raw, it makes you itch horribly, and sometimes, helps fester diseases on you. Really gross. But it was used to create a sense of asceticism and misery. So these people are wearing these souls are wearing haircloth to give up what they desired. Dante has this moment where he feels really uncomfortable about all these souls because he can see and they can't, and he feels that distinction between them with some discomfort, but Virgil kind of encourages him to go ahead and talk to them anyway. And there's this great moment where he says, "Virgil was walking by me down the ledge, on the side from which, because no parapet had circled the cliff, one might plunge off the edge. On the other side, those spirits kept their places, absorbed in prayer, while through the ghastly stitches tears forced their way and flowed down from their faces." It's a really grotesque imagery of their eyes being stitched shut, but tears squeezing through and rolling down. But also notice how Virgil is still in that role of protector, as he has been throughout the Inferno. And this is a good reminder of that, because Virgil has been a bit clumsier now that we're in Purgatory. He really doesn't know the way around, but he's still there to protect and to guide and to support Dante, just as he, a moment ago, was supporting Dante in helping him decide what to do, how to speak to these souls. Now he's also guiding and supporting Dante, keeping him from the edge of the ledge. And Dante asks, "Hey, are there any Italians around here? Tell me if there is any Latin soul among you here. I dearly wish to know, and telling me may help him to his goal. So I can maybe help you out, after all." But they point out Dante's mistake. As we noticed in the Inferno, when we talk about tenses, the souls always speak of themselves in past tense because they're dead now. But Dante made the mistake of asking if there are any Italians here. Are there any Latins here? Well, they're not Latins anymore because they're dead. So now they're not. And Sapia points this out to him when she replies. She says, "We are all citizens of one sublime and final city, brother. You mean to ask who lived in Italy in his pilgrim time?" She points out to him that they're now bound for heaven, so their citizenship is no longer in a particular location on earth. They're all bound for heaven. Their citizenship is in heaven. Whereas the lost souls were so fixated on where they were and hanging on to who they were, they never were able to let go of who they were. These souls have let go of their past and are headed towards some sort of future. And even the past, their life on earth, they call a pilgrim time. It was a time of transition. It was a time of moving towards our ultimate goal, which is our citizenship in heaven. Everything is very transitory in this section, as opposed to fixed and trapped and stuck, like in Inferno. And here's that section that I mentioned before, where Dante seems to have trouble locating the soul that's talking, as if he were blind. "These are the words I heard a spirit say from somewhere further on. I moved up, therefore, in order to direct my voice that way." Directing his voice as if, I can't see, so I'm directing my voice, even though he can see. "I saw one shade who seemed to have in mind what I had said. How could I tell? She sat, chin raised, the waiting gesture of the blind." As if she's expecting something, even though she can't see him, so she can't turn in his direction. And this is Sapia, the Sienese woman, and she tells her story to Dante, and how she wished ill on her own town because of her position, and how she rejoiced at their destruction and failure, and so she's condemned for that. Her envy causing her to look down on others and to wish ill on others. And fortunately for her, she was prayed for by the local kind of loony guy. He was his name's Pierre, and he was kind of a little off, but apparently he really prayed for people really, really hard a whole lot, and so he prayed for her soul. So he prayed for her soul, and she was able to skip a lot of the time down below Purgatory, where we saw those who waited very long time, because she waited a long time in her life too. And so she asks about Dante and how he is here breathing and speaking. Again, the blind seem to be able to hear his breathing very carefully, because their sense of hearing is more attuned because of their blindness. And Dante points out, oh yes, the same old story, I'm alive and I'm traveling through this way. And he also says, I'm not going to stay here very long when I arrive in Purgatory, because envy's not really my sin. My sin is definitely pride, which is down below. My soul is gripped by a far greater fear of the torment here below, for even now I seem to feel the burden those souls bear. We're reminded of the burden, the weight that the prideful have to bear, and Dante knows that's really his thing. Pride is something he really struggles with. It's where he's going to wind up spending most of his time, probably. And Sapia's really confused. She's like, okay, how can you be up here if you're afraid of down there? And he reminds her that he's still alive. And she says, oh, this is a thing so rare, it surely means that God has loved you greatly. From time to time, then help me with a prayer. And she also asks him to remind her kin to pray for her. It seems very important that a person's family pray for that person. And so one of the great things that Dante can do is tell these stories of these souls. They're very eager to have their stories told, unlike a lot of those in Inferno, because having the story told will get that person's family to pray for that person, and that person will ultimately be able to move more quickly through the process of purging. And notice how she talks about how God seems to really love Dante. And so there's that divine love that's constantly being placed upon Dante and helping Dante through this and guiding Dante through this. And we know the divine love, of course, is from God, but it's also from Beatrice. And we're reminded again about how the structure of Purgatory is all about love. And there's a bit about that in this section. Dante then overhears these two souls speaking back and forth, and we open the next canto with this conversation between two souls without really describing them. Again, it's sort of like being blind. We don't see them, but we hear them, and Dante overhears them before he actually sees them. There are two more souls who are discussing him because they've heard him, and now they're discussing back and forth the fact that he's alive. How is he alive and still here? So these two souls finally ask Dante who he is, how he got down here. Tell us your name and city, for your climb fills us with awe at such a gift of grace as never has been seen up to this time. You know, how were you so lucky to get to go, so graciously gifted, blessed, to come up this way? And Dante replies kind of cryptically. He vaguely describes the river, the Arno, that he lives near, but he doesn't mention anything particularly specific about himself or about his birthplace. And he concludes by saying, as for my name, to tell you who I am would serve no purpose. I have as yet won very little fame. It's almost as if, after mentioning how pride is such an issue for him, he tries to be very humble here and sort of say, I'm not important, my name's not significant, I'm no big person. And so it's like he's trying to act humble finally for once. But in so doing, we explore kind of another tension, because after this, Dante's going to ask their names and ask who they are, because he wants to know them. But he's not willing to give his name. He's not willing to give his story or where he's from. And so there's that sort of, I want something you can give me without giving of myself, which reminds us perhaps of envy. So Dante's envious of the knowledge of who they are without being very forthcoming with himself. And Guido de Duca points that out. But yet, at the same time, he's very generous and liberal and willing to give. He's learned to overcome this sort of stinginess of envy, and he's able to give to Dante and be very generous with his name and information. But before that, we have this big, long tirade where Guido talks about the Arno and the cities around the Arno and how they're horrible places. They're full of all kinds of awful behavior. And all of these awful behaviors he compares to different animal, bestial kind of like behaviors. And he compares it all to Circe. Remember the story of Circe who transformed the men into animals in the story of the Odyssey? Well, here again he talks about each of these different towns. They act like different kinds of beasts. Some of them are foxes, some of them are dogs, but they're all awful. And in the midst of this, he gives yet another prophecy about Dante's future exile. But he doesn't give it directly to Dante. He's in fact giving it to his partner, his friend here, because it pertains to this man's grandson. Rinieri has to hear this story of how his grandson is ultimately going to cause all this destruction in Florence. And it seems sort of odd that Guido seems to know about what's going to happen with this man, but Rinieri, whose grandson it is, doesn't really seem to know it. So how does prophecy exactly work in the afterlife? It's really not super clear. I should point out here also that we're still dealing with pairs of souls, just as we have all throughout the Inferno. But this time, again, the pairs are supporting each other and helping each other in their progress towards heaven. So these two are leaning against each other and supporting each other. After the two finish speaking, Dante and Virgil begin to move on, and they don't get directions this time, but they know the souls hear them as they're walking away, and the souls don't comment, and therefore they presume that must mean that we're going the right way, because they would definitely note if we were going the wrong way, because they hear us going. After all, they wouldn't wish us will as an envious soul would, because their envy is being purged. It's an interesting setup, and I'm not exactly sure why he does that. There's probably a really significant point, but I haven't figured it out yet. Do you know? And just after they leave these two souls, they hear the reign of envy. And if you remember, the reign of pride, back in the first Cornice, was those images that demonstrated what overwinning pride does to a person. So there's all these different stories of these souls who had great pride and were destroyed because of their great pride. Well, now we're going to have the reign of envy, where we hear stories that remind us of the great danger of envy and how envy can destroy you. But instead of being pictures to look at, these are once again these disembodied voices that shout at Dante and startle him, but also remind him of stories of envy. The first is the story of Cain, who envied his brother Abel. Abel had made a sacrifice, and God had approved that sacrifice, and Cain was jealous of that, and so he killed his brother, the very first murder in the Bible. And so in that story, Cain is marked because of his envy of his brother, and because of this violent act against his brother, and so because of that, all men will reject him. We have the story of Agloros. We have the story of Agloros, who's turned to stone because of his envy, and Virgil points out that that is the reign, and he reminds Dante what it is, and Dante's so terrified by it. Virgil kind of says, come on, don't get afraid of that. That's supposed to help you, and you're not really letting it help you, you're just getting scared of it. Come on, let's go. And so they move on. Instead of thinking about love, learning from these and thinking of love, Dante is being fearful. That brings us to Canto 15, and I'm not going to go all the way through Canto 15, I'm just going to stop at the end of the envious, and then move on to the wrathful next time. So it's moving towards afternoon, and we've made a lot of progress today, but the night is coming on, and Dante begins to feel like there's a horrible light in his eyes, and he's trying to protect his eyes and block out this light. It turns out it's not the sun shining in his eyes, but the next angel at the post here. And Virgil points out that their radiance is something that, as Dante progresses, he will become more and more able to bear. And we're going to see, again, that pattern in Paradiso, and it's really going to be explored as Beatrice becomes more and more beautiful the closer we get to God, but Dante also becomes more and more able to bear beauty and bear the brilliance of heaven. But for now, he's still kind of on his sinful journey, and he's just being purged of all these different sins. Once again, the angel passes them through very briefly. There isn't a long description here. Dante loses another P, and he hears the angel singing behind him as he continues on, as we'll see on each occasion. And things get easier now, too. Blessed are the merciful, and rejoice you who have won, is sung behind him. But before they go on, they talk a little bit about love, and the love that was being used as the counterpoint to envy. After all, the soul from Romagna, Renier, said something that caused Dante to become confused, and so he talks to Virgil and seeks clarification. So when Renier was talking in the last canto, he said, this seed I sowed, the seed of envy. This sad straw I reap here. O humankind, why do you set your hearts on what it is forbidden you to share? Why do you get so intent on grasping what you cannot share? The envious are always trying to grab what's not theirs and hold on to it instead of rejoicing in the good that others have. And Dante here asked for clarification from it. He said, he spoke of sharing and said it was forbidden. And Virgil says, he knows the sad cost of his own besetting sin. Small wonder he reviles it in hope that you may have less to atone. It is because you focus on the prize of worldly goods, which every sharing lessens that envy pumps the bellows for your size. But if, in true love, the highest sphere, your longing were turned upward, then your hearts would never be consumed by such a fear. The more there are there who say, ours, not mine, by that much is each richer, and the brighter within the cloister burns the love divine. They talk about worldly goods, which, when you have money, you can only divide it so much, and so hoarding it gets you more, is kind of the idea of the envious and the greedy. But love is something that the more you share, the more you have. And Dante's a little bit confused about what he's talking about here, but he continues to talk about that idea. How can each one of many who divide a single good have more of it so shared than if the few had kept it? Wait a second. When you share something, you have less of it. How does that work? But love's not like that, is it? The more you give it away, the more you have. Love is a really great substance. And throughout Purgatory, Dante is going to be corrected for earthly thinking. Every time he thinks of something in physical, earthly sort of terms, he's going to be reminded, you can't think of it that way. You're going to have to think of it in divine, eternal terms, spiritual terms. And so when you think of things that when you divide something, it's smaller. But that doesn't work in spiritual terms. In spiritual terms, the more you share, the more you spread around love, the greater it grows. We're also going to see that same sort of issue in the next canto when we are talking about free will. Dante's going to be very confused about why things are going so wrong, and he's going to have a clarifying lesson on free will. We're going to see again and again this pattern. Dante thinks from a worldly perspective. You divide something, it's smaller. But he's reminded of a spiritual perspective. That doesn't work that way with love. The more you spread it, the more you have. As mirror reflects mirror, so above, the more there are who join their souls, the more love learns perfection, and the more they love. And Virgil says, and if you still don't understand, don't worry, we're going to eventually see Beatrice, and she will fully explain it to you. After all, she is our symbol of divine love. Only strive hard, that soon no trace may show of the 5 scars which true contrition heals, as the first 2 have faded from your brow. So he still has 5 P's left on his brow he's got to get off, but he's making progress, and he's beginning to learn. He's leaving behind that worldliness and moving towards the spiritual. And we'll stop here before we get into the whip of Wrathful. And I'll see you next time as we continue this week's section. You know, I think I feel lighter. It must be that missing P. Or maybe it's just my new haircut. Bum 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 bum, Purgatorio, bum 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 bum.